To be mine and Olivia's last Sunday here with you. We'll still be here this Wednesday, so we're not leaving this afternoon or anything. Excuse me, but this is our last Sunday here, and I just wanted to tell you, not to take up a bunch of time, but how much I appreciate each and every one of you, how much I love you and have grown to love you. And Olivia and I will always count this as our first church home together. And we hope to not be strangers here. We hope to be able to see you frequently over the years. So I just wanted to let you all know that I love you and I appreciate you. And you've said nothing but kind things to both of us through this process, through this transition. So getting to other matters at this point. In the summer of 2013, I worked as a youth intern for a church in Birmingham, the Roebuck Parkway Church of Christ in Birmingham, Alabama. And I was housed there with a family the Lewis family was their name. They had 4 kids and a 3-story house on a beautiful hill in Criswell, Alabama. If you've ever been up in Birmingham area, you know it's a beautiful, pretty area. But this house was 3 stories. The very top floor was the area where where I stayed, where all the kids stayed when they were home. There was only one of their children that was still at home full time. But the top floor was the bedroom area where me and the other kids would sleep. The middle floor was the kitchen, the living room, and the master bedroom where the parents stayed. And then the bottom floor was kind of this game room area. There was a TV room with a PlayStation. There was a pool table. And then there was this like kind of private room with no windows that had 2 couches kind of on 2 different levels with a TV screen. So it was kind of a movie theater room. And the one of the kids that was actually still there for the summer, the others had went off to college and been married and everything. But the kid that was there over the summer, his name is Seth. And he was going into the 7th grade at the end of that school year, or at the end of that summer. So he was still fairly young. Seth and I spent a lot of time together over that summer. We called each other our summer brothers, and we still call each other that whenever we see each other today. But Seth has and had asthma. Seth had to take breathing treatments pretty much every night, and one of my first tasks as an intern and kind of living there at the home was to learn how to operate his breathing machine, to put the medicine in the machine and to administer it if something happened kind of just in case. So me and Seth would often hang out on the bottom floor at night. Usually he would be out playing PlayStation. I would be in the theater room. That was kind of where I casually did lesson planning and things and watch movies at the same time. So it was a pretty nice setup. But he would usually sleep out there on the couch in the PlayStation room. And about every night at some point, usually around 2:00 in the morning, he would have a mild but manageable asthma attack. And this was literally like every night would have a mild asthma attack. He would start coughing and he would have to administer his breathing treatments. And then there was this one night about halfway through the summer. I was in the the theater room working on a Sunday morning Bible class, and he was out playing PlayStation in the other room, and he begins to have an asthma attack, which, like I said, was not out of the ordinary. It wasn't something that I was completely surprised about, but I always would kind of keep my ear out to hear if anything happened that I needed to be in there for. So usually you would know he was having an asthma attack because he had night coughs, and so he would start coughing, and it was labored coughing. And then this night, halfway through the summer, I'm in the theater room, he's outside, and I hear him start coughing, and I wait for him to, kind of crank up the breathing machine and administer his treatment. And the coughing goes on for a little too long. And I started to get concerned, so I actually got out of the couch and went to the door. And I heard him coughing, and I heard him in this faint, like terrified whisper saying, "Help." And he was just repeating, "Help, help, help." And so I jumped over the second couch, went out to the door, and I saw him on the couch, and he was struggling with his breathing apparatus, his breathing treatment. And so I ran over and I put the medicine in, and I helped him. Get the medicine in, get the cap closed, and put it up to his mouth. And he breathed 3 times, and then his head fell down. And I picked his head up and tried to put the breathing treatment back in, and by the time I got his head back up, his lips were already blue. He had stopped breathing. And so I tried to, do what you see. I mean, hopefully not comical, but what you see in movies when someone passes out, trying to kind of slap them and wake them up. Seth, wake up, wake up, wake up. And he didn't wake up. And I was panicked. And so 2:30 in the morning, I run as hard as I can. It feels like just one motion up the stairs. And the mother of the family, Kitty Lewis, she had an operation on her leg, so she had to lay in one position in the bed and have her leg up, elevated. So her husband, Barry, was asleep on the couch right at the top of the stairs. So I bust up the stairs and I wake Barry up and I tell him what's going on. And me and him run down the stairs kind of in one motion. He gets Seth off of the couch onto the floor and starts administering CPR to his son to try to get him back. And at that moment, I ran back upstairs. I woke Kitty up. I woke one of the daughters that was there, Melanie, for the week. And I went back downstairs, called 911. And by the time I got back down there, he was still working on Seth, and he had not come back yet. And it was until Kitty got down the stairs with her leg doctored up that he started to gasp again and started to get back his breath. And I just watched, and I tried to help as much as I could, but I just watched that night a father show the most amazing amount of love that I've ever seen for a son. Seth stopped breathing for what we think was about 2 or 3 minutes. You can't count time in that kind of situation, but we think he stopped breathing for about 2 or 3 minutes. He ended up making a full recovery, and like I said before, I still see him today, so he is alive and well. He made a full recovery. It was a long week in the hospital as they were trying to adjust his medication, and they finally got it, at this point, I think, to where he barely ever has asthma attacks again. Every time I see Seth, he always wants to tell everyone about the night that I saved his life. And I always laugh and get him to tell the story, but the fact is, Seth was unconscious whenever someone was saving his life. And it wasn't me. It was his father. That night in 2013 at 2:30 in the morning, I witnessed one of the deepest and abiding demonstrations of a father's love for his child. Barry Lewis saved his son that morning. And I was a witness to the intensely calm and unflinchingly determined father who would stop at nothing to bring his son's life back from the death grip. And that's the kind of focused love that I see in fathers if they were ever put in that situation today. I love to hear stories like that. It gets me excited. We love stories like that. We love stories that display the unflinching love of a father for his children. Stories of relentless stop-at-nothing acts to demonstrate their love in a tangible way that we can see and understand in our daily life. And it has the potential to motivate us to be better people and be better fathers, that maybe we'll hold our families tighter at night and realize how much of a blessing they are. We love a good family man. That's a lot of political stuff is about, I'm a family man, writing on political advertisement and things like that. We love a provider. We love a protector. We love someone who his kids love and respect him, and his wife loves and respects him. And we especially love a family man who's put in the unfortunate situation of having to put his role as protector into action. And it kind of helps to restore our faith in humanity a little bit. As Christians, our God is our Father. And the way that we see our God as Father largely has to do with how we see our biological fathers, or with some of us, our lack of biological fathers. None of our fathers are perfect, which will make the way we view God as Father a little bit flawed whenever we try to perceive him. But I believe that the reason why we love a good hero father story and why we respect a loving, caring, providing family man is because it's a reflection of what kind of father our Father in heaven actually is. And we can't help to be drawn to things like that because we're created in his image. So within our own souls, woven into the fabric of who we are at our very core is who God is. And so stories about a loving, heroic father figure rings true to us because we know in our very being that that's a demonstration of true fatherhood that comes from the Father above. But because of our inevitably flawed view of what it means for God to be a father, it's better to look at the Father, at the eternal Father, and for us to form our view of how fathers be instead of the other way around like we often do. This morning, I'm not planning on giving you fathers tips on how to be better parents. I think there's a time and place for that. Instead, this morning, I want us to sit at the feet of our Father and to be able to see a glimpse into the way that he loves his children. If you have a Bible with you this morning, I'll ask you to turn to Luke chapter 15, and that's where we're going to be the whole time. Luke chapter 15, if you'll turn there, please. In Luke chapter 15, we're going to be reading a parable this morning. And for those of you who don't know what a parable is basically kind of a short story, short pithy story from a wise leader. And it contains layers and layers and layers of meaning. The parable that we're going to be reading today is commonly called the parable of the prodigal son. And it's actually the third of three different parables that are told at one time. And it has a lot to do with the crowd that has formed around Jesus and is listening to these parables. If you're in Luke chapter 15, quickly look at verses 1 and 2. And this is kind of the background of what we're doing today. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." The Pharisees and the scribes, the people who are the religious leaders, the righteous people of their day, they're astonished with Jesus and the company that he has been keeping and the people that he has been attracting. He's been attracting known public sinners to his ministry events. And as a public figure and as an advocate of the God of creation, you shouldn't be seen with sinners, much less eat with them and share a meal with them. So Jesus responds to their concerns, to these people's concerns, with three successive parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal or the lost son. In the lost sheep parable, I'll give you a quick version of it. There's a man who has 100 sheep. One gets lost, so he leaves the 99 and goes and finds the one. He carries it back on his shoulders, and when he gets back, he has a party or a celebration with the friends in his neighborhood, celebrating the fact that he had found his lost sheep. He lost 1%, and then he found it again. And then there's the parable of the lost coin. A woman loses a coin in her house. It's 1 out of 10 coins. And it's not a penny, it's a day's wage for her, so it's quite a bit of money. And what she does is she tears apart the house in order to find that coin. And when she finds it, she has a celebration with her neighbors. The lost object, the lost sheep and the lost coin in both of these parables represent the people who are coming to Jesus's talks, the people who are gravitating towards them, the lost sinners. And it captures this idea of these lost sinners being found by God. And then we come to the lost son, or the prodigal son parable, which again communicates the same things, but with more depth and clarity compared to the other two. And a personal layer is added to it, the layer of fatherhood. So if you're still in Luke 15, will you look at verse 11, and I'll begin. And I'll stop a few times and explain and talk about some things. Luke chapter 15, verse 11. And he said, "There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Give me the share of property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living." To set the parable up, Jesus begins with the 3 main characters of the story, the father and his 2 sons. In the first parable, it was 1 out of 100. bigger odds. In the second, it was 1 out of 10, but in this parable, the odds and the stakes increase and the loss increases to 1 out of 2. The younger of the sons decides one day that he's ready for his family inheritance now rather than later, like you would usually get your inheritance as the father died later in life. So in a way, the younger son was saying to his father, "Hey, Dad, I wish that you were dead already, but instead of that, can I just have my inheritance now and we'll just settle this that way?" And some of you fathers might already think how you would handle that situation. Of course you can't have your inheritance. Get back to work. You're my son. You can't do that. But that's not the way that this father works. Instead, he complies, and the son gets his inheritance. And a few days later, he gathers his things, which are truly his father's things, gets his things, leaves the house, heads down the driveway, and goes to the far country. The younger son's decisions are summed up in this word that's translated wild, or riotous, or reckless, or loose, or prodigal living, depending on what translation you may be reading. So he went and he tried to experience everything that he possibly could that he couldn't do under his father's roof. Look back in verse 14. We'll read 14 through 19. "And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' When the money runs out, the far country experiences a famine. There's no rain, no crops, no food to be had in that area. And Dad's not around to help get him out of this hole. So he goes out and he hires himself to a pig farmer. At this point, if the disrespect and irresponsibility and moral failure of this young man has not disgusted the crowd already, this is the one that tips the scales, because this is a Jewish audience. And in the Jewish Levitical law, a pig is considered to be an unclean animal, which would make an Israelite ceremonially unclean. And to be ceremonially, that's a mouthful, unclean, means that you couldn't approach God for a full day. And this is his everyday occupation. So he cannot approach God any longer. For the crowd listening to Jesus, the younger son is now on the level of those tax collectors and sinners that were showing up to the talk. The younger son hits rock bottom the moment after realizing that he's actually jealous of the food that the pigs have for themselves. And he has an epiphany. He sees this image of his father's servants sitting down to their table, to baskets of overflowing food and plates full of plenty of food. He realizes that if he goes back home and if he works as a servant, that he'll be taken care of, that the servants in his father's house are taken care of because he is a good father and treats his servants well. So he works up this speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your servants. Have you ever done this sort of thing? If you're in a disagreement with someone, you resolve to make amends over what happened. And before you go to them, before you call, you're probably doing two different things. You're probably praying about it, and you're probably reciting what you plan to say. And that's what this son is doing, rehearsing his apology speech as he heads back to his home. Look at verse 20. We'll go to 20 through 24. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and he felt compassion. And he ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. So the story doesn't tell us how long this has been going on, but this father has been waiting and looking and searching for any sign of his son coming back. And when he sees him, he feels compassion for his son, so much so that he gets up and he runs toward his son to greet him on the road. According to many commentators, this is an interesting cultural moment when it comes to the father running. It was considered an undignified act to do as an older man, to run, because in that day, what you wore as clothing would have been a long robe. And for a father to run, for anyone to run, would mean to hike up that robe, expose your legs, and to run and kind of be the fool of the town for a moment. So this father, and it would bring shame on this father because it's an honor-shame type of culture. But this father, he ran to go meet his son who by all accounts deserves the shame that's coming for him for what he's done. But instead, the father takes the shame of that moment onto himself rather than his son. And he, in his pure joy, runs to greet and embrace his son. And after the long hug, the son still delivers that speech. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your servants." What would you say to that? "No, son. Yes, son, you can work as a servant 20 years, and then maybe we'll talk about considering you as a son." But that doesn't happen. The father's response is to call the servants and to say, "Bring some clothes. Bring some shoes. Kill that cow we've been raising up for a special occasion, because this is the occasion that we've been waiting for. My son was dead and he was lost, but now he is alive and has been found." And that's where the other two parables end. But this one goes a little further with an added layer of meaning. Look at verse 25. "Now his older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I've served you, and I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him?' And he said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and has been found.'" So while the older brother is out in the field, he comes closer. He hears some kind of commotion in the house. The text says music and dancing. And he calls this servant over and says, "What in the world's going on in the house?" And he says, "Your brother's back. He's been found, and your father was so excited that he put together this celebration so that we could celebrate what has happened." But instead of excitement, the older son's face drops, and he goes from curiosity to confusion to anger and disappointment. And he refuses to go and see that despicable thing that he once called his brother. And he decides, "I'm going to stay out here." The older brother's hurt. "How could you, Dad? I haven't even left you. I've never left you. I've always done what you've asked. I've never disobeyed you. And you've never thrown a party for me and my friends. But this son of yours goes out and spends all of his money on whatever he wants. And he comes back for one day and you kill the best of our herd." What's that older son actually upset about in this moment? The older son thought that he deserved something more for his good and long-lasting behavior and loyalty. But the father gets square with the older son's eyes and says to him, "You have always had those things, But your brother, he was as good as dead. He was lost, and we found him, and he's back, and he's alive. Your younger brother isn't getting anything more than you have already had for yourself." And that's how the parable ends. When you read this parable and you understand the audience that Jesus was talking to, you realize that the characters are designed to reflect the situation of the crowd. The father in the story is God, and more specifically in this moment, Jesus, who is accepting these people from the crowd. The younger son is the tax collectors and the sinners, and the older son is the Pharisees and the scribes that are there gathered that are angry about who Jesus is accepting. The scribes and the Pharisees hold a flawed view of God as Father. And so they have a flawed view of God. They have a flawed view of those who are lost in sin as a result of that. And this parable is designed that the crowd sees the younger son and sees that he had done something incredibly shameful and disgusting. He lived a morally disgusting life, which stirred up righteous anger within the Pharisees and the scribes naturally. The younger son left home, he wrecked his life, and the older son stayed home with the father. And the listener at this point, through the parable, is supposed to favor the older brother until you read that last piece of the conversation, where Jesus flips the scenario upside down, and the older son demonstrates his fundamental misunderstanding of the father's love. The older son thought that he had earned his spot in the house. And he was into this kind of transactional view of closeness and love with his father, of what he had done and what he had earned. And the older son failed to realize that the gift of being in the father's house is the father himself and not the son. The younger son didn't assume much. He just knew that he wanted to be back in his father's house. The older brother, the scribes and the Pharisees that we read about at the very beginning, are perfectly okay with God loving and saving them based on their ability to be good, but they're not okay with God loving those people. God doesn't love the way that they want him to. God doesn't love the way that we sometimes want him to. He loves as he chooses, and that is far better than what the scribes and Pharisees were wanting. So what does this have to do with you? When we look at this parable, we might be tempted to think of it as just a neat illustration of the spiritual concept of God's love. And it is that, but it's a parable, so it has layers upon layers upon layers of meaning when it comes to the story. So I think there are 3 different takeaways that we have from this morning. Number 1, some of you are the younger brother, and you have a father who loves you. Some of you are the younger brother who left for the far country. You've burned bridges, you've lived directionless, and you have done things that you never imagined you could actually do. And you think you're too far away, but you're not. Who do you think you are that God cannot transform you? If you are still breathing, you are not too far gone. And our God saves those who we deem unsavable. He saves those who think that they can't be saved. And trust me, he would love to prove you wrong in that matter. Turn around today, come back home. There is love and forgiveness in our Father's house at the cross of Christ. There are some of you here this morning that are the younger brother, and you are on the other side of coming back home. You've lived in the far country. You have done all of those things that the son in the story have done. And you know now that life is far better in the Father's house. You have an incredible gift to bring to the church, if that is you. Because you know what it's like to live far away from the Father's house, and you know what it's like to come back. And you can find others who think that they're too far gone and help to show them the way back home. Some of you are the younger brothers, and God loves you. Some of you are the older brother, and you also have a father who loves you. Older brothers, you are someone who has always been in the Father's house. And that's those of us who have been raised in the church and never really did the whole sow your wild oats thing very much. and you have what some have unfortunately called a boring conversion story. By the way, I don't think any conversion is boring when God is involved in transforming a human life. But being someone who's always been in the Father's house is nothing to be ashamed of. It is something, though, to be a little careful with, because you may not have something of perspective that you need. This morning, if you're an older brother, you need to examine yourself deeply and see what this parable has to say to you. And I'm not talking about an older brother biologically. I'm talking about with the story. You need to examine yourself deeply and see what this parable has to say to you. You're probably very happy with the Father loving you, but are you okay with the Father loving those people who can't seem to get their lives straight? Do you look down from your nose at the lost or those who are brothers and sisters who are in the far country right now? Do you think you deserve something more for your resentful loyalty? If that describes the position of your heart, you are in danger of something that Jesus says later in chapter 16, verse 15. You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. You may be putting far too much stock in your ability to stay loyal to the Father, and you don't yet realize that the Father's presence in your life is a gift to you, not the other way around. Some of you are the older brother who has been woken up to the reality that not everyone has to have the same story and background as you in order to be in the Father's house, and that is a good thing. You see now that God desires for all to be saved, and that you're in a unique position to bring the other younger brothers into his house and to show them what it means to serve rightly. Third takeaway, the Father loves both of them. We have to realize that our Father loves whom he chooses to love. He has compassion on whom he chooses to have compassion. And the scribes and the Pharisees were angry with Jesus' love and treatment of sinners because they fundamentally believed that they were more worthy of God's love than those people. The parable demonstrated to the scribes and the Pharisees that God loves who he chooses to love, not who they want him to love. And God often chooses to love those who we deem unlovable. God saves those who we, the religious, often deem unsavable. This is not a parable about how awful a son can be to a father. That's what the word prodigal means, is this son that goes out and does all this crazy stuff. This is not a parable about how awful a son is. This is a parable about how compassionate and loving a father is toward both of his sons. And even so, in this parable, the Father's love does not equate to salvation, because we see that the younger brother still had to return home to his father. Did the father love the younger son as he was away? Of course he did. There's no doubt about that. But he still had to turn around. For those who are still away in the far country, you are not safe just because the Father still loves you out there. You must come home to him, and he is waiting for you, watching the horizon for you to come back. For those of you who are older brothers, it is possible for you to be just as lost as the younger brother and to have never gone anywhere whatsoever based on the way that you view the relationship between you and the Father. God is not blessed to have someone like you. You've got that relationship totally backwards. He is your reward for faithfulness, and he is enough. Wrapping up this morning, a lot of Father's Day sermons tend to be based around the goal of helping fathers to become better fathers, and that is a good goal. But fathers, if you want to be a better father, if you want to be the best father that you can be, become a son of the eternal Father and deepen your understanding of the relationship between God as Father and your own fatherhood. If there's anyone here this morning who wants to become a child of the Father, you need only to repent of your sin and to turn toward him and to be baptized into Jesus, his Son. When we're baptized into Jesus, we're baptized into his death, and we're raised with him just as he was raised from the dead. And it's there that according to Romans chapter 8 and Romans chapter 3, that Jesus covers us with himself, and that God adopts us into his own family as his own children, as a son or a daughter of God through Jesus. If you've always been in the Father's house this morning, but you think you've been straying from relationship with him under his own roof, come back to him this morning. He is waiting. Realize that the gift of being faithful to God is not more stuff in a bigger party, but it's that you are the child of the King of creation. If anyone has anything, any kind of needs this morning, any things you need to express, fathers, if you want to commit your lives to God for the first time as your father, you have the opportunity to do that this morning as we stand together and as we sing.